Good morning. Earlier this month, I joined the Board of Community in Crisis, a local group which is doing amazing work. It was founded specifically to help address the opioid crisis right here in the Somerset Hills. It is now expanded to look at all substances which destroy individual lives and communities. My first board meeting, someone mentioned the show Dope Sick. Anyone seen Dope Sick? Good, okay. I hadn't seen it, I hadn't heard of it. I went home, I watched it again. Now I'm going through it a third time slowly with my mom. Every time my mom comes up, we watch a few more episodes. If you haven't seen it, the show tracks sort of three different storylines which all sort of braid together. There's one part of the story that looks at the pharmaceutical company, Purdue Pharmaceuticals, who made and marketed OxyContin. And then there's another storyline which deals with the law enforcement agencies, DEA, ATF, FBI, that are investigating Purdue Pharma for their marketing of OxyContin and trying to bring them down. But the hardest to watch storyline is this small Virginia coal mining town, which at the beginning seems kind of idyllic and lovely, and by the end of the show it is just, it is decimated. You can just watch the effect that opioids had on that community. It tracks some specific individuals, like the doctor of the town, played by Michael Keaton, and then this other family, this coal mining family. And you can tell that there's some dysfunction already, way before OxyContin, with this coal mining family. The daughter of the family is also a coal miner, young girl, and in a freak accident, her back is injured very badly. She's in a lot of pain, and her doctor, played by Michael Keaton, has just heard of this miracle drug, OxyContin, that can make all of her pain go away, and so he gives it to her, and she does fine for a while until she doesn't do fine. And completely unrelated to the drug use, the dysfunction of the family erupts. And there's one night at the dinner table where the father says to his daughter, Betsy, you need to get out of here. Tomorrow morning, you're out of here. And Betsy says back to her dad, no problem. And then her use and abuse of OxyContin gets worse and worse. She ends up doing everything she can to get a hold of one pill, and then another pill, and then another pill. She's falls into multiple stupors, and everyone in her life sees her demise. I think one of the most powerful moments of the series is when she's asked to come home, and she goes home, and she walks in the door, and there's her family with all their problems, and her friends who never would have been in the presence of her family for any other reason than to come together to have an intervention with Betsy. And her father looks at her and says, in reference to all of their troubles, Bets, none of that matters anymore. In other words, her life is what matters. All the dysfunction, all the anger, all the fighting, all the issues, it doesn't matter when it comes down to life and death and a family's love for each other. Incredibly powerful. The show's not for everybody, but it's affected me deeply. This morning's gospel lesson is Jesus praying on the night before his death. Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us that he does pray, and they give us a little smidgen of that prayer, but it's John that gives us the fullness of this prayer that Jesus prays on the night before his death. In John's Gospel, it lasts several chapters. It's known as the high priestly prayer. And we see in it that Jesus is praying for us. In the very beginning of this lesson, he says, I'm praying for my disciples, but not just them, but also those who will come after them, which is us. We can oftentimes think about the Bible as being a story that happened like a long time ago in a land far, far away. People spoke languages we don't even speak anymore. But there in this morning's gospel lesson is you and me. Jesus, on his last night, is praying for us. And part of his prayer for us is that we would be one. He says to God, his Father, as you and I are one, may they, us, be one. Jesus is praying for us, and he's praying for our unity. And you could look at this and say, well, we've totally blown that, right? I mean, here we are at the Episcopal Church, and the Methodists are down the street, and the Presbyterians are a little bit further. We're in this, relatively small, medium-sized town. There's an Episcopal church and a Reformed Episcopal church a half mile that way. There's a Catholic church, there's a Lutheran church, there's 2 Baptist churches. May they be one as you and I are one. But, so you could look at that and say, like, well, we totally failed. I'm not convinced that the splitting into denominations is what Jesus is talking about here. I think it's good that there's a variety of churches and communities around. Some people find, like this is their home, and some people hear God and find God and God's community in a different place, and that's perfectly fine. I just want them to find God. I'd love them to find God here. But if they got to find God somewhere else, that's fine. When John wrote this gospel with this long prayer embedded in it, it's the last gospel written. It probably written 90, 95, 100, which puts it 60, 65, 70 years after Jesus' ministry, death, and resurrection. That's a long time, 70 years. It was long enough that the church in those 70 years after Jesus' death and resurrection had experienced multiple issues, arguments, and internal and external pressures. We can sometimes romanticize the early church. They had their problems every bit as much as we might have ours. Some of their issues most of their issues dealt with the fact that Jesus' parents were Jewish, Jesus was Jewish, all of Jesus' disciples were Jewish. What's the relationship between Judaism and this new thing we're calling Christianity? One of the huge questions they wrestled with is, does somebody who never was Jewish, do they have to become Jewish in order to follow Jesus? Do they have to become circumcised? Do they have to eat kosher? Follow Moses, and then you can follow Jesus. Huge question. Huge question was, do we leave the synagogues? When the synagogues start kicking Christians out in the first century, do we fight and stay? I mean, they're all saying the same thing we would say. This is our church. Our ancestors put these stained glass windows in, right? My family's been sitting in these pews forever. Why do I have to leave? Then they would argue about Christians in Gentile lands. All meat that was eaten in Gentile lands had been slaughtered in a pagan temple, offered to a pagan idol, and then it was taken out to the market to be sold. Can Christians eat meat that's been sacrificed to an idol? Huge question. Some people said, absolutely not. That's participating in pagan idolatry. God says you can't do that. Other Christians, like Paul, said, not so fast. Those gods don't exist. As long as you realize that, it's probably okay. 64 AD, Rome burned down. Christians were blamed for it. We had no part in it. It had nothing to do with it. We were just blamed. It was better. It was easier to blame the Christians than it was to blame Emperor Nero, who was fiddling while Rome was burning. And out of that, the first major persecution of Christians happens. Brutal, awful, bloody. There were other persecutions that followed. Roman soldier would come to your door and say, "Are you a Christian?" And if you said yes, that meant that you and everyone in your house behind you would be thrown to the lions or crucified upside down. So some people said yes. They stood by their faith to the very end and died horrible deaths. Some people said no. In order to save themselves, in order to save their families, they said no. So then the big argument is, are they still Christians? They denied Jesus. Are they still Christians? Some of those people who denied Jesus when the sword was at their neck were bishops and deacons, leaders of the church. Not only are they still Christians, are they still bishops and deacons? Are the people that they baptize actually baptized? Huge, huge questions. And I know we hear these issues today and we go, oh, those aren't big deals. Like, those are small deals. They were big deals back then. And if the world's still around in 500 years, they're going to look back at us 500 years from now and say the issues that we fought about, those weren't big deals. Things always look easier in the rear view mirror. They were huge deals. I think one of the reasons why John includes this long high priestly prayer when Matthew, Mark, and Luke didn't feel like they needed to include it was because John felt like his church needed it. In that moment, with all the church was going through, all the internal pressures, all the external pressures, John wanted his church to know that on the night before his crucifixion, he prayed for our unity. He prayed for us to be one. That doesn't mean necessarily uniformity in all things. Pick any family, any group, any church. You get a group of well-meaning people together in a room, you're going to have different ideas about how things should be done. And if you have different people who really are invested in this family, in this group, in this organization, in this church, and they have different ideas, sometimes those arguments are going to get loud. And that's okay. I mean, as long as, people aren't slandered and horrible things happen, we can argue it out and hopefully come to a good answer. Hopefully come to a good compromise. It is okay to disagree. Disagreements can actually make us stronger. But there are other kind of disagreements that only divide. Arguments, issues that seem to be bent, the purpose of them is to divide us. Jesus called us to be one. Like Betsy's father, to be able to say, okay, all this other stuff we've been fighting about, none of that matters anymore, because what matters is this. First Christians, with all they were going through, all the internal pressures, all the external pressures on them, the stories of their faith is amazing. When there was a earthquake, they would rush into the places where the earthquakes was to save and minister to not just their own people, but to any people. When a plague would come through, and plagues went through all the time back then, Christians would go into those places, risking their own lives to minister not just to their own people, but to other people. And they probably, those Christians that were rushing in, probably disagreed on whether you could eat meat that was sacrificed to idols, or what you had to do about circumcision, or, and all of that. But in the crisis, in the moment, none of that matters anymore. What matters is this. There are moments where we need to put down what divides us and lift up what unites us. If floodwaters are rising and we're stacking sandbags You don't turn to the person next to you and say, "Are you a Presbyterian? Get out of here. Wait, are you a Baptist? Are you an American Baptist or a Southern Baptist? Okay, get out of here." No. In our creed, the Nicene Creed, we say every week, we believe in one holy, Catholic, and apostolic church. I get a question like once a year, twice a year, why are we saying we believe in the Catholic Church? If you notice, it doesn't say the Roman Catholic Church. It doesn't say Catholic Church with a big capital C. It's not the name of the church. Catholic is an old world for universal. We believe in the universal church, the church that transcends St. Mark's in Basking Ridge, the church that transcends the Episcopal Church, the great body of believers that's around this globe. We believe in one body of believers. Do we have our differences? Yes. Do we have our arguments? Yes. Does it get heated sometimes? Yes. But there are moments where we need to heed Jesus' last prayer for us on the night before his crucifixion, and be one. Our world has been in one of those moments for a long time. An opioid epidemic, a COVID pandemic. This week, parents, once again, having to pick out caskets for their school children. There are different ideas and different thoughts and different perspectives about how to deal with each of those issues, and especially with what happened in Texas this week. And we need to be one. We can't just keep letting crisis after crisis wash over us and not do anything. We need to come together and do something. And I don't know exactly what that is. But I believe it has something to do with Jesus' last prayer for us. That when he prayed that prayer, he had us in mind. And somehow, some way, when he prayed that prayer, he had this time in mind. Somehow we need to be able to form our people, our church, this society as people of compassion and grace and mercy, so that these things don't happen, and somehow a society of safety where if they happen, our children are protected. The details will get worked out, but the details cannot get in the way of us uniting. When we come together, when we see ourselves as one holy Catholic and apostolic church, when we join together with Christians up and down the street and around the community and across the nation and across the globe, we don't just do a good thing, but we are fulfilling Jesus' great prayer for us. Amen.